President Kennedy officially restarted White House-directed covert action against Castro's Cuba in early 1962. This was under the White House-directed sabotage, harassment, and regime change operation known as Operation Mongoose. Accordingly, in early 1962, gruff ex-G-man William Harvey, the head of Task Force W, the CIA's Cuba section, brought in a fresh new station chief to head the Miami CIA station, codenamed JMWave. JMWave emerged as the busiest U.S. spy station not only domestically, but across the world in the early 60s, especially as the Kennedys and their self-appointed covert action ace, Edward Lansdale, ramped up their Cuba project. According to authors Warren Hinckle and William Turner, over the next few years from 1962 to 64, JMWave Station, quote, operated on a budget of well over $500 million a year and employed between 600 and 700 American personnel. End quote. This is of course not even counting the thousands of Cuban exile assets employed by the agency throughout the secret war. The new station chief was brought into the Sunshine State largely to solve a challenge that was increasingly facing the agency on all facets, that being the management of an ever-expanding coterie of intelligence assets. In intelligence speak, this is known as human intelligence, or simply HUMINT for short. The new boss in Miami was a young spy who had generated a lot of buzz for his work in West Berlin under the very same Bill Harvey that was pulling him back stateside in the early 60s. For the past half-decade or so, the young spook had been working the infiltration circuit in Germany, spearheading the CIA's often futile attempts at infiltrating assets behind the Iron Curtain. Now, on the sunny coasts of South Florida, he was trading Eastern European defectors for fanatical Cuban exile raiders. The new fief of JMWave was a man named Theodore Ted Shackley, later immortalized by his nickname, which he reportedly disliked, known as the Blond Ghost. Shackley's chance elevation to the top job in Miami in the wake of the Bay of Pigs invasion paved the way for him to become one of the most influential covert planners and operators at the agency, as maybe the man who was single-handedly the most responsible for the CIA's paramilitarization throughout the 1960s. From Cuba to Laos to Vietnam to Chile, and finally his off-the-books work during Iran-Contra in the 1980s, Ted would leave his mark in the shadows, and often undetected, in the dark-lit offices and boardrooms, in whatever remote outpost he found himself in. As much as we may still have a romantic vision of spycraft as a mixture of cocktail-tinged schmoozing and boom-and-bang covert action, the reality was often significantly more mundane. Often, the name of the game was managing assets, as boring as that sounds on the surface. Be it Cuban exiles in Miami, Hmong guerrilla warriors in Laos, or provincial reconnaissance units in South Vietnam. Simply put, Ted Shackley brought the analytical and bureaucratic expertise necessary to track and analyze the activities of the ever-expanding pool of off-the-books Central Intelligence Agency assets and targets. In other words, Shackley helped codify the increasing human intelligence requirements of the paramilitary CIA. For the Blond Ghost, an often overlooked but instrumental spook within the CIA's history, the art of spycraft was found in data sheets and organizational charts, not at cocktail parties or foreign embassies. Although less glamorous than his Ivy League predecessors, Shackley's work effectively allowed the CIA to expand its capabilities dramatically, to eventually running a full-fledged secret war in Laos before the end of the 1960s. As we covered last episode, the CIA was changing, and Ted Shackley represented one of the major figures within that change, from the old boys towards the operator culture that would emerge throughout the 60s and eventually into the sort of peak in the 1980s with Iran-Contra. So today, let me begin with a short overview of the early years of one of the main characters of my ongoing studies, Ted Shackley, as the agency continued its expansion in the paramilitary realm. Let's begin untangling the story of the Blond Ghost.
I will do my level best to stand up for freedom and democracy around the world by keeping the United States of America strong and by keeping our eyes wide open as we welcome change in the world, but keeping our eyes wide open.
Ted Shackley's general absence and near omission from so many CIA histories is somewhat understandable, as his activities remain shrouded and obscured to this day. I mentioned earlier that Shackley was known primarily for being elusive, and that is maybe an understatement. Finding photos of Ted Shackley where he is front and center still proves difficult, as the only widely publicized photo of the Spymaster where he is center frame remains the author photo on the back of his first book, The Third Option, published originally in 1981. On screen now is every other known photo of Ted Shackley that I've been able to track down. Beyond that, I sincerely believe that he was never captured publicly on video. And trust me, I have looked everywhere. This has become somewhat of a white whale for me, and yet I have never been able to find him on video recording. This level of elusiveness would be completely understandable for a low or even medium level CIA operative. After all, part of their job as intelligence officials is to be elusive. Yet Ted Shackley was no small fish, which made his continued anonymity an increasingly remarkable feat. After his first postings in post-war Germany with the legendary William King Harvey, Shackley would be promoted to serve as the station chief at JMWave in Miami by his former boss Harvey, who himself had been elevated to a top role in the Cuba show in Langley, heading Task Force W and the aforementioned ZRRIFLE, the CIA's Executive Capabilities Office, aka their assassination program. I covered this at length in my previous video. Shackley's tenure as station chief in Miami coincided with the height of the CIA's plots against Castro and the paramilitary boom on the Gulf Coast, making this one of the most prestigious appointments to any aspiring CIA staff member in the agency. From there, later in 1966, Shackley would once again be put on the front lines of the CIA's paramilitary efforts, this time heading the CIA's activities in Laos during the major escalation years of the secret war there, serving from 66 to 68 in that capacity. Maybe now you are starting to see why I decided to take a sidestep into Florida before continuing with my Laos series. Incidentally, many of the top agency operators in the Keystone Southeast Asian state cut their teeth first in Miami and Louisiana, including the Blond Ghost himself. For Shackley, being posted in Laos from 66 to 68 was only just the beginning, because in 1968, Ted was again promoted to head the CIA station in Saigon, South Vietnam, until roughly 1972. There he would help roll out the infamous joint CIA-Pentagon counterinsurgency program known as Phoenix, first conceived by future CIA Director William Colby, himself acting as a mid-career mentor for the Blond Ghost himself. Shortly before Colby assumed the CIA directorship in 73, Shackley was elevated in 1972 to his first executive position at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, as the head of the Western Hemisphere Division, a coveted job overseeing all covert activities in the American continent. There, the Ghost played an instrumental role in Project Foo Belt, the CIA-backed coup of Chile's President Salvador Allende on September 11, 1973, to be replaced by the brutally repressive Augusto Pinochet. During this same period, while Shackley was posted at CIA headquarters in an executive role in the early 70s, he was in line to inherit the coveted CIA Israeli file from the aging counter-espionage chief James Jesus Angleton. According to researchers such as Joseph Trento, Ted became the new lead man at CIA besides Angleton with the Israelis, a relationship that he would continue to call upon in an official and unofficial capacity throughout the 1980s and the Iran-Contra era. Shackley's role in Miami, Laos, Vietnam, Chile, and finally as a coordinator with Israeli intelligence cemented his reputation as a top planner and schemer, especially when it came to establishing covert funding sources for high-profile and largely illegal intelligence operations that U.S. policymakers were increasingly relying upon into the latter Cold War and post-Vietnam period. This reputation as a mastermind bureaucrat, human intelligence whiz, and expert paymaster followed him into the 1980s after he was forced into retirement from official intelligence work by the incoming Jimmy Carter White House. But that was not before he reached his career peak at CIA in 1976, when he was promoted to Associate Deputy Director for Operations, which is 2 rungs under the directorship, by none other than CIA Director George H.W. Bush. Interesting to see Bush elevate Shackley to his top job at the CIA, especially since the two had likely crossed paths a decade and a half earlier, both as young CIA assets in the Caribbean. Both Shackley and Bush would be shuffled out of CIA shortly after their ascension to top roles, after President Jimmy Carter entered office in January of 1977. Bush was given the door in favor of Carter's nominee for CIA director, an outsider, Admiral Stanfield Turner, who was promptly ordered to clean house at CIA. This was borne out in what was known colloquially as the Halloween Massacre, as several of the long-standing CIA old boys were terminated in another attempt to reform the agency. Sounds oddly similar, doesn't it, to JFK's attempted restructuring at CIA a decade and a half earlier, as we covered in the last episode. Well, in 1977, Shackley was one of the casualties of the Halloween Massacre, being firstly demoted from his post in December of that year, and officially retiring from the CIA altogether by 1979. But that was not it for the Blond Ghost. No. Ted would reemerge during the 1980s working as the coordinator and owner of a dizzying network of shell companies associated with the ongoing efforts by the Reagan administration and the CIA to arm the Contra forces in Central America. Notably, former CIA Director Poppy Bush, now Vice President Bush, was likely apprised of his old colleague Shackley's involvement in the whirlwind logistical web known as Iran-Contra. Shackley's involvement in the Contra effort would actually lead to one of his only reported public appearances, in September of 1987, when he was forced to testify before the Senate Select Committee on Secret Military Assistance to Iran and the Nicaraguan opposition. I have linked the transcript below if you're interested, but do not expect to glean much from Shackley's cagey and avoidant testimony. He was nicknamed the Blond Ghost for a reason. By giving a high-level overview of Ted Shackley's intelligence career, a career that ran parallel with the CIA's global program throughout 3 decades, I hope that you can begin to see why it remains impressive that so little has been written about or discovered regarding the ubiquitous Shackley. He was seemingly everywhere that the CIA was, often at a top role managing hundreds of employees and assets, and acting as the highest-ranked man on the ground in Florida, Laos, and Saigon, before becoming an executive at Langley, overseeing an even wider net of intelligence intrigue. Yet what we are left with is fragments. Shackley appears sparsely in CIA memos and reports. In terms of news articles, before his death in 2002, he was largely overlooked by the mainstream press. Before diving headfirst into his early career, I want to do a quick source review today, because when talking about Shackley, especially pre-Laos, we are left with so few sources of information. Ted will remain a main character of my studies for the next few seasons at least, so I think an overview of the few sources fully dedicated to the man himself is in order. Since I will often be leaning on 1 or 2 sources for the information in my upcoming videos regarding Shackley, I want to preface today with a disclaimer and a review of said sources so that you can all critically evaluate the admittedly rare information that I will be conveying today. I should start with the books Shackley wrote or co-wrote himself. During his lifetime, Shackley wrote 3 books, 2 of which were released while he was still alive. These 2 contemporaneous works, 1981's The Third Option, An American View of Counterinsurgency, and his 1989 work, Still the Target, Coping with Terror and Crime, provide very few biographical details, instead focusing on Shackley's personal thoughts and recommendations to decision makers regarding the use of intelligence agencies and the evolving global security landscape at the time of publishing. His first book, The Third Option, first published in 1981, only 2 years after his official retirement from the CIA, is a fundamentally bitter work. The book, which Ted dedicates to the Hmong fighters he employed in Laos against the North Vietnamese, opens with a denunciation of the Carter administration, which ordered the termination of he and his cohort of operators in the aforementioned Halloween Massacre. Beyond the obvious grudges held by the exiled Shackley, The Third Option acts as a manifesto of sorts, arguing for Ted's view of his self-defined quote-unquote third option in international relations. The third option is presented as outside of the conventional dichotomy of international politics, that being between diplomacy and open warfare. Shackley's third option encompasses all quote-unquote secret intelligence operations, but with a specific emphasis on the use of covert paramilitary operations to shape the world to the US's liking. This includes, in his words, quote, all aspects of covert action, which in some lexicons is defined as the influencing of people and the shaping of events through the use of political, economic, or military factors without the sponsor of this activity being identified in an attributable manner, end quote. In a nutshell, Shackley advocates for increased covert action backed by plausible deniability and for the US state to rely more openly on intelligence agencies in dealing with international conflicts. According to Ted, the CIA and other intel agencies were best equipped to counter the emerging challenges posed by the various communist insurgencies across the globe in the early 80s. Or as he puts it, quote, "The paramilitary aspect of the third option can be used in support of offensive or guerrilla warfare operations. It can also be harnessed in counterinsurgency operations, which are defensive in nature." End quote. He then makes an interesting prediction. Quote, "As the 1980s are likely to be a decade in which the United States will be reacting to challenges much like a counter-punching boxer, it has been assumed our irregular warfare concerns will focus on combating quote-unquote armed clandestine organizations, whose primary goal is to impose their will on the population in the countries where they are attempting to seize power." End quote. The release of this book in 1981 coincided almost perfectly with the ascension of the Reagan administration, which would see the return of the CIA to its pre-Carter, pre-Halloween Massacre glory under OSS Oldboy, Deep State Operator, and, pardon my language, Orwellian freak William Casey. Not to mention the Reagan White House with its former CIA director turned Vice President George H.W. Bush, Shackley's former boss, would oversee the rollout of Iran-Contra, a worldwide narco-counterinsurgency operation that saw Ted acting as an off-the-books logistics whiz for the agency and its allies. With this in mind, his book, The Third Option, reads more like a policy prescription than a reflection, as his quote-unquote third option was further institutionalized as regular policy under Reagan, who leaned heavily on his CIA to arm guerrilla soldiers across the globe. Throughout my chronicling of Ted Shackley's career, we will see flashes of the third option pop up, especially as he helped usher in the CIA's first paramilitary programs in first Miami and then Southeast Asia. As an author, Shackley's works were always eerily compatible with the issues of the day in the top foreign policy circles in Washington, D.C. If the third option was a perfect roadmap for the incoming Reagan administration, his 1989 book, co-authored by Shackley, titled Still the Target: Coping with Terror and Crime, acted as a similarly well-suited piece, this time for the incoming Poppy Bush administration. In 1989, the Cold War was winding down, and the hawks in the military intelligence blob were developing a new paradigm to replace the once omnipresent threat of global communist subversion. This would of course evolve into the now ubiquitous global war on terror, which simply swapped out the communist threat with an ever-pervasive terrorist threat. Maybe not as prescriptive as Shackley's previous book, still the Target sets out to provide practical methods and techniques to travelers on how to avoid or mitigate the impacts of a terror attack. As the description on the back of the book states, quote, "Whether a traveling VIP or Mr. and Mrs. Joe Average, Still the Target gives the reader the most up-to-date facts and strategies available for coping with the threat of terrorism today." End quote. Shackley and co-author Richard Finney's book was published seemingly to cash in on the incoming terror threat hysteria, although it would only be under Bush's son's administration that the global war on terror would really get off the ground, designed and rolled out by Bush the father's cronies, which he placed in his son's administration. With that said, Shackley's 1989 book, Still the Target, which has been largely forgotten and seemingly barely sold at the time, again showed that Ted was plugged into these evolving paradigms, and was even maybe a bit too early to this particular development. Nonetheless, Ted seemed to follow his former boss Bush's whims to a T. Yet most importantly to my research is Shackley's third book, titled Spymaster: My Life in the CIA, which is as close to an autobiography or memoir as we ever got from the KG spook. Originally published posthumously in 2005, 3 years after his death, co-author Richard Finney claims in the first pages that he and Shackley completed the manuscript shortly before his death in December of 2002. Accordingly, this work remains a truly sanitized history of Shackley's life, not only for the fact that he was personally involved in its writing and authorized its release, but also that it was published by Potomac Books, a publisher that had released several other similar quote-unquote official CIA history works, such as a book by U-2 pilot Francis Gary Powers and other CIA hagiographies. Funnily enough, in Spymaster, Potomac Books is said to be based in, of all places, a town called Dulles, Virginia, the municipality containing Dulles International Airport in the DC metropolitan area, which feels like a wink and a nod if I've ever seen one. Dulles, Virginia is also only about a 20-minute drive from Langley, Virginia, where CIA headquarters is based. So it wouldn't be much of a stretch to speculate that Potomac Books was in some way affiliated with the agency, but again, this is all speculation. Now, returning to Spymaster, usually I am hesitant to use official CIA histories as they tend to be sanitized and overall quite dismissive of some of their more controversial operations. Yet since there are so few sources related to Ted Shackley, and especially as I mentioned earlier, so few sources dealing with his early CIA career, I will pull occasionally from this work, mostly in the rare instances where the Spymaster book offers some unique insight about Ted that isn't available elsewhere, or maybe just for a little bit of additional flavor here and there. Although the book does often portray intelligence work as mundane and wholly uncontroversial, Shackley does tell on himself inadvertently at some points. I will make sure to point these instances out when they do come up, because Spymaster does admittedly include some interesting admissions to those who know the broader history of CIA operations at the time, so I will dig into those when they come up. Now, there is really only one secondary biographical source that is fully dedicated to uncovering Ted Shackley's exploits throughout his varied career, and that is David Korn's 1994 book, Blond Ghost. Interestingly, his first published book. Blond Ghost to this day remains the only full-length piece written specifically about Shackley that was not written by the man himself. So naturally, I will be pulling extensively from Korn's book throughout this presentation and in most other instances where I discuss Ted. But first, I need to lay out a few disclaimers. David Korn is an establishment journalist, having written for a long time for The Nation magazine and as a regular contributor to The Washington Post and The New York Times. Korn was afforded unique access to CIA sources in writing this work, and although he raises some truly fascinating information about Shackley and his cohort of spies, we do have to tread with caution here. As researchers looking into Ted Shackley, we are forced to take Korn at face value, as there is no way to independently verify the information he conveys, that he gathered from his high-level CIA sources. With this type of journalistic access, we have to assume that his work was reviewed by the agency itself, or at the very least, that the sources were vetted to be compatible with the narrative the CIA wished to portray before their interviews. So although I will be citing David Korn's work extensively, I want to caveat this extensive citation with the fact that we as readers have no way to confirm whether the information he gathered is fulsome, or, in the case of CIA sources, simply limited hangouts. I hope to intersperse my own interpretations throughout, and as always, when I do so, you will see this green eye icon appear at the top corner of the screen, indicating that I am simply speculating or adding my own analysis. So with all that out of the way, let's start at the beginning. On July 16, 1927, Eleanor Shackley, formerly Lena Anna Sadova, a first-generation Polish immigrant, gave birth to her first son, Theodore George Shackley Jr., in Springfield, Massachusetts. Although his parents didn't know at the time, a CIA legend was born. Allegedly, rumors and gossip regarding the cagey CIA prodigy Ted Shackley circled around the water coolers at Langley during his tenure there. Many believed that the reclusive and secretive Spymaster had grown up an orphan, abandoned by his mother at a young age. As it turned out, the Blond Ghost had not been an orphan, but he was indeed born into a fractured home. His first-generation immigrant mother from Poland, Lena Anna Sadova, later known as Eleanor, had, like so many other newcomers looking to assimilate into their new country, married an American man with little thought as to whether it was a good idea or not. That American was Ted's father, Theodore Shackley Sr., a salesman. She was 17 and he was 22 when they married in Hartford, Connecticut in 1925. The marriage was difficult from the beginning, as Theodore Sr. was a drunk and was often absent from the household for bouts of drinking at local taverns. Interestingly, experiencing an alcoholic father at a young age may have ultimately led to Ted Jr.'s lifelong avoidance of alcohol. Ted's parents split in 1929, not to be officially divorced until 1937. And although the marriage was fraught and short-lived, it did produce one child, born in 1927. This was, of course, Ted Shackley Jr. Shackley would spend his early boyhood jumping between cities. After his mother split with Ted Sr., the two moved to Queens, New York, where she found work at a hotel in Manhattan. Eventually, single mother Eleanor sent her son away to live with a woman who Korn speculates was his Polish grandmother out in New Jersey. This is likely where the young boy learned to speak Polish, an at the time unknowably valuable asset to his future intelligence career. While he was in New Jersey, Shackley's mother met her second husband, a 50-year-old purchasing agent for one of the railroads named Justin Manning. Nearly 20 years her elder, Manning was able to retire shortly thereafter off of some successful investments. From there, Manning took his fiancée and her son to a new house he had bought for them all, in of all places, West Palm Beach, Florida. An area that would become increasingly significant for the young Ted some 2 decades later, when he'd be put in charge of the CIA station in Miami, less than 100 miles south from the new family home. There, on the sunny Florida coast, the young Ted and his mother weathered the Great Depression, thanks to his adoptive father's significant fortune. Ted Shackley Jr. was part of a cohort of American boys that are often overlooked or outright forgotten in our collective imagination of this period. With so much emphasis placed on the baby boomer experience post-war, the so-called silent generation of which Shackley was a part of are continuously overshadowed. But more specifically even, were the silent generation types that were children during World War II, too young to serve in the war and too old to fit into the boomer generation that came to dominate American pop culture during the Cold War. Young Ted, a reportedly patriotic and politically engaged teenager, likely brooded seeing his fellow countrymen go off to war, while he was stuck in his idyllic Palm Beach bubble. According to David Korn, Shackley made many attempts to join the military during the war, but he continuously came up short. Aged 14 in 1941, the athletic football-playing high schooler was barred from serving in the World War until the very end in a non-combat role. Despite this, Korn notes that in high school, Shackley was, quote, considered one of the brightest, ready, and able to speak up in any classroom discussion, end quote, hinting at his future prominence as an expert briefer in America's future spy agency, as we will see in a bit. In 1945, just as Shackley was graduating high school, it was his turn to go overseas. Ted finally enrolled in the military in October of that year, despite the fighting being over in Europe by that point. Although he avoided combat, his role in the military with the Counterintelligence Corps, or the CIC for short, would foreshadow his lifelong journey as a clandestine operator. Although he was speaking of his time in occupied Japan, CIC recruit Harry Brunette's statement on the Counterintelligence Corps experience is enlightening in regards to Ted's possible experience in Germany at that same time. As Brunette stated to authors Alec Dubro and David Kaplan in their book Yakuza, quote, "You had to be lily white to get into CIC and turn coal black to stay in." And also, quote, "That CIC badge was your authority to do anything. If they told you to break in and steal some documents, you did it. We'd trade with the devil if we had to." End quote. If that was the CIC experience in post-war Japan, it is safe to assume that in occupied Germany, young Ted was also getting his first taste of skullduggery. The CIC formed one key piece of the US's impromptu World War II intelligence apparatus. Formed originally as the Corps of Intelligence Police during World War I as a quasi-police force attached to American expeditionary forces in Europe, it was revived as the Counterintelligence Corps in 1941 to mostly serve investigative counterintelligence functions stateside during the war. The CIC resembled a military police unit more than anything else. As the name implied, the Counterintelligence Corps worked to root out potential subversives and double agents in the Army and other federal departments in the US. As the war ended in Europe in 1945, the Allies were charged with administering their portion of occupied Germany. Initially, the occupied territory was split between 4 zones, one for each of the Allied powers. Eventually, these divisions would crystallize into the Western-aligned West German state, formed from the 3 Allied portions of Germany, and the Soviet satellite state of East Germany, from the Soviet-occupied portion. In the immediate post-war years, the US ordered the CIC to act as a constabulary force in their occupied quadrant, essentially acting as military police in the tumultuous wreckage. It is there, in the pressure cooker of 1945 Germany, that Ted Shackley cut his teeth on his first intelligence assignment, with the 970th Detachment of CIC. It was likely Shackley's ability to speak Polish that got him a role in the CIC, a clear asset in unsettled post-war Europe. It is important to emphasize the absolute state of turmoil that Germany and Europe as a whole were in late 1945. Following 6 years of all-out combat, the European landmass began to resemble one large refugee camp, with displaced people from across Europe floating around in the post-bellum chaos. Prisoners of war, refugees, displaced people, war criminals, everyone was in motion, either fleeing or seeking refuge in this tumultuous environment. Included in this entropy of displaced people was the US CIC, sent to bring some sense of order to the orderless chaos of post-war Germany. And amongst those cohorts of CICs was Ted Shackley. In the book Spymaster, Shackley only mentions his time at CIC once, saying, quote, "It was in Berlin in 1946 to 47 that as a fuzzy-cheeked young man doing his military service in an Army Counterintelligence Corps CIC unit, I became interested in intelligence as a career." End quote. For such an allegedly formative experience, he provides us with zero details on what that formative experience entailed. As we know now, one of the major responsibilities of the CIC in post-war Germany, which to David Korn's credit he does mention, was to track down fugitive members of the Nazi elite, first to detain, and later to either send to stand trial, or to employ under secret agreements. As Korn puts it, quote, "Shackley was sent into the wreckage of Berlin as a low-level CIC operator. And, quote, he worked in displaced persons camps and put his Polish skills to use, interviewing refugees, looking for war criminals, past Gestapo agents, and subversive Poles. Shackley did more than question DPs, here meaning displaced persons. He trundled through the rebel-strewn streets of Berlin in search of persons on automatic arrest lists." End quote. To the CIC, high-valued German targets were any members of the Nazi party hierarchy, high-ranking military officers, and most famously, German scientists. Yes, the CIC and by proxy Ted Shackley were at the front lines of what would eventually become Operation Paperclip, which was the now well-known program put in place by several US departments and agencies, but most famously the Army and the War Department, to secretly smuggle out and employ the top ranks of the Third Reich's research and development staff. These included the men in charge of developing the V-2 rocket, the first self-guided, liquid-fueled ballistic rocket ever developed. The US and the Soviet Union both developed their own rocketry programs largely thanks to the post-war absorption of German scientists into their own research teams. But more pertinently, Ted Shackley as a CIC official in Germany, therefore, could have conceivably come into contact with some of these high-value targets, including scientists. If he was indeed involved in these operations, which the CIC were largely responsible for, he may have even had some insider knowledge of the deals cut between the US and these high-value targets, maybe even knowledge of the rat lines established by Western intelligence to get Nazis out of Germany and into mostly South America, but also the United States and Canada. Shackley's understanding of these controversial and, at times, highly secret operations could help to explain why he was scouted for intelligence work, specifically with the CIA after the war. Since he was already clued into one major government secret, he was in a sense already in the club. A few more secrets wouldn't hurt. Now would probably be a good time to mention that Shackley had also been given his first formal intelligence training during his time at the CIC, at the European Theater Intelligence School at Oberammergau. The Intel School in the Bavarian Alps acted as the major US intelligence school in Europe at the time, which would eventually become the NATO School, a major educational facility for incoming cadres at NATO. At the time, in mid-1946, when Shackley was reportedly sent for training at Oberammergau, a former CIC 970th veteran had just been transferred to the facility, now serving under the Army's Military Intelligence Service. That instructor, who very well might have taught the young Shackley about intelligence, was none other than a young Henry Kissinger, recently relieved from his duties in the CIC. This chance meeting between the teacher Kissinger and the pupil Shackley is particularly interesting, when taken in the context that Shackley would 2 decades later be the man on the ground for the CIA in both Laos and South Vietnam, while Henry Kissinger, first as an unofficial advisor on Indochina and later acting as Nixon's national security advisor, was personally responsible for the bombing campaigns that supported Shackley's irregular forces in the subcontinent. Not to mention Kissinger himself had a significant role in Project Foobelt, the overthrow of Chilean President Salvador Allende in 1972, an operation that Shackley planned and undertook from his post at the CIA Western Hemisphere Division. Safe to say, the student did not drift far from the teacher. But what is especially important to note for now is the particular importance of the Oberammergau complex that Shackley was trained at. In later years, especially when Shackley would return to Germany in the early 50s under CIA employ, Oberammergau and the surrounding areas south of Munich would be host to former Wehrmacht intelligence chief on the Eastern Front, Reinhard Gehlen, and his so-called Gehlen Org. From his headquarters in the southern suburb of Munich known as Pullach, Galen worked in the late 40s and early 50s with US intelligence in assembling offensive commando paratrooper teams to infiltrate behind the Iron Curtain. These teams were trained at the nearby facilities at Bad Tolz and Oberammergau, where Shackley in the early 50s, a CIA officer in Germany, was once trained as a CIC recruit. Not to mention, as we will see later in this video, many of these future recruits into the Galen Org commandos were likely once scouted out by CIC forces such as Shackley himself. So with all that said, although we know little of Shackley's day-to-day activities with the Counter-Intel Corps, his stated work gathering valuable future high-ranking members of the Galen Org and the formal intelligence training he received at Oberammergau makes his recruitment into the CIA in 1951 unsurprising in retrospect. He was in many senses the perfect candidate to facilitate the early CIA paramilitary work in Germany. Shackley officially ended his military service with the CIC on February 22, 1947, and by the fall of that year he started his freshman year in college. Originally, he wanted to attend an Ivy League school, the typical path into intelligence. According to the preface to Spymaster, Shackley had apparently been offered a scholarship at Princeton, coincidentally the alma mater of another earlier US Spymaster, the one and only Allen Dulles. But instead, according to the legend anyways, the all-American Shackley kept a promise he had made to a high school friend that they would continue to play football together in college. And thus, the Blond Ghost did not get the Ivy League education that was so common at the early CIA, but instead went to the significantly less prestigious University of Maryland. The Spymaster book theorizes that Shackley would have attained the rank of director of CIA if only he had attended an Ivy League school, which I can only interpret as a line Ted told himself to help cope with the fact that he never did ascend to the top job at Langley. Despite missing out on the Ivy League fast track, the recruiters at the CIA ultimately tracked him down eventually as an ideal candidate, regardless of his more modest education. By 1952, Shackley was in the employ of the CIA and on his way back to Europe, landing in the most prominent flashpoint of the first Cold War years, West Germany. Ted Shackley was recruited into the CIA while he was in the process of joining the Army. Ted, a member of the US Army Reserves, had been called up to the military to fight in Korea. As the story goes, he was subsequently called to a building in DC by what he thought was the Army. Soon he would discover that these temporary buildings next to the Lincoln Memorial housed the covert action staff of the new CIA. As the official story goes, when he arrived at the temporary building, he was escorted to an office where several men in suits told him he had been selected to join the CIA based on his credentials. Of course, those credentials being his experience in the CIC and his proficiency in Polish, and now German, as he had taken several German language courses while at university. Shackley was then promptly recruited into the CIA in the Office of Special Operations, which was the intelligence gathering portion of the agency's Covert Operations Center. The OSO was originally set up as a complementary office to the now infamous Office of Policy Coordination, a quasi-independent covert action bureau that reported to sometimes the State Department, sometimes the Department of Defense, and sometimes the CIA. Although the two offices were originally founded to work in tandem, in practice, the two held a bitter rivalry, fighting for monopoly over covert operations during their short lifespan. When Ted Shackley was recruited into the OSO in '51, the office would only exist for another few months, before it and the OPC were merged into the streamlined Directorate of Plans under the cunning Frank Wisner, all under official CIA purview. While men his age streamed into the new war in Korea, the Blond Ghost headed the other way, back to Europe. According to David Korn, after brief intelligence training in Washington, D.C., Shackley was shipped off to Germany as a fresh young recruit for the burgeoning spy agency. Every intelligence agent's dream posting in this time was, of course, in West Berlin, the epicenter of the newly minted Cold War. Yet for the Blond Ghost, Berlin was not on the agenda yet. Instead, he was sent to the CIA base in the former propaganda center of the Third Reich, and where the Allies had hosted the highly publicized war crime trials of the Nazi hierarchy and their sympathizers, that being the smaller town of Nuremberg. Considered a comparative backwater assignment, Shackley was leading the charge as one of the case officers in charge of smuggling Eastern European CIA assets behind the Iron Curtain. In Shackley's case, Poland was likely the target, given his fluency in the language. Arriving at Nuremberg in 1952, Ted met with the station chief at the small spy base, none other than the one and only Lucien Conein, the Corsican-American spook who got his start in Southeast Asia with the OSS during the war under Paul Helliwell's Detachment 202, and only a couple of years later, in 1955, would return to Southeast Asia in South Vietnam, advising the nascent DM regime in Saigon alongside Edward Lansdale. This posting in the southern German city, on the surface anyways, was unusual for the thuggish Conein. His expertise was in paramilitary work, having worked alongside the French resistance during World War II in the south of France, as part of the famous Jedburgh teams, and later having trained irregular forces in Burma and Indochina to counter the Japanese occupying forces, to then be diverted over to Germany, a hotspot for traditional intelligence activities, remains somewhat puzzling. Personally speaking, I have given this strange matchup significant thought, and after having researched post-war intel ops in Germany, I have come to the conclusion that Conein's seemingly strange appointment to the Nuremberg base is actually compatible with a larger project that was underway in Bavaria at the same time, by both the CIA and the Gehlen Org. While Shackley was being recruited into CIA and shipped over to Germany in 1951 and 52, another development was taking shape at the highest echelons of the agency. As previously mentioned, the Office of Policy Coordination, the Frankenstein Covert Action Office that reported to both the State Department and the Army, and the Office of Special Operations at CIA, were merged into the Directorate of Plans under Mississippi-born Wall Street lawyer Frank Wisner. This was an incredibly significant event in the history of CIA covert ops, as beforehand, US civilian covert action was a jumbled mess, reporting to several different governmental agencies and lacking a singular purpose and vision. Under the new Deputy Director of Plans Wisner in 51, CIA covert action was regimented. In taking the Deputy Director of Plans job, Wisner was replacing the omnipresent Allen Dulles in the once marginal role at CIA, as the elder spook then took a promotion to Deputy Director at the agency. And by February of 53, of course, Dulles would himself be at the top job at the CIA. Importantly, under this Dulles-Wisner axiom, starting in 1951, the CIA and its allies in the Pentagon would really start to actively collaborate with the former Nazi intel chief Reinhard Gehlen. As I've covered in previous videos, Reinhard Gehlen, the former Nazi Army intel chief on the Eastern Front, was secretly given immunity from prosecution at Nuremberg by US CIC and OSS officials, including Allen Dulles, in the last years of the war. Gehlen, promising his US captors his coveted collection of microfilms regarding Soviet secrets, and access to his network of intel assets and insurgents behind the Iron Curtain, was seen as an invaluable asset to the early US intelligence apparatus. Sent back to Germany after some time in the United States in 1946, Gehlen quietly set up shop in the southern Munich neighborhood of Pullach, where he revived his dormant intel network of collaborators and stowaway Nazis, known, of course, as the Galen Org, or simply the Org. By this point in 46, the OSS had been disbanded by Truman, and by 1947, when the CIA was established, many of the original purveyors of the Gehlen deal were not present. Dulles, for example, only rejoined the agency in 1951 as the Deputy Director of Plans. And later that year, when Wisner was brought originally into the agency and Dulles took the number 2 job, the OSS old boys were ready to finally instrumentalize the secret Gehlen apparatus. Much of the information I am reporting here comes from the book Galen, Spy of the Century by E.H. Cookridge. This is a fairly old book, first published in 1972. But the information contained is still extremely interesting, especially as it has continued to be validated by more recent researchers, such as John Loftus in his book The Belarus Secret, and Christopher Simpson in his book Blowback. I will be pulling from all three of these works in this upcoming section, but I wanted to single out Cookridge's book in particular as it was one of the first to break the Galen story in detail. According to Cookridge, after taking the number 2 job at CIA, quote, Dulles had made it clear to Galen that top priority must be given to the selection and training of agents for work in Russia, end quote. I have spoken at length about Western intelligence operations under the Gladio umbrella, essentially the establishment of stay-behind forces in Western Europe to fight against a potential Soviet invasion. These forces were often comprised of former fascists and collaborators from the former Axis regimes throughout the continent. By 1951, when Dulles and Wisner were taking over the CIA, the prospect of a Soviet invasion of the West appeared increasingly unlikely. The Office of Policy Coordination under Wisner had successfully intervened in the Italian election of 1948, stopping a communist victory at the polls, and the CIA had effectively supported the monarchist forces in the Greek Civil War throughout the late 40s, thwarting a communist victory by the remaining leftist partisan forces. The European boundaries of the Cold War by 1951 had largely crystallized, and the need for Gladio stay-behind operations was increasingly in question. Now, of course, I don't want to take away from the fact that we know that these forces did remain in place and continue to operate in the shadows for Western intelligence and NATO, especially in Italy and Belgium. But as it stood, the Dulles-Wisner leadership turned the focus of their prized Gehlen Org away from domestic Gladio stay-behind activities towards offensive strike forces in the event that support for a potential coup was needed behind the Iron Curtain. Or as Cookridge puts it, quote, the Dulles brothers believed deeply that Stalin's captive nations would rise against communist oppression given a modicum of encouragement. A private mercenary force was to be established in Germany, to be ready for such an emergency, and to be employed without involving regular US forces, end quote. And it's within that paradigm that Reinhard Gehlen was directed to form a new covert strike force of commandos. But also, as I'm going to suggest, possibly included at the working levels of these plans, was new CIA recruit Ted Shackley and his paramilitary expert boss, Lou Conein. Galen was instructed by his CIA benefactors, who were paying for most of this, to begin the establishment of this so-called quote-unquote special forces, which I put quotes here because this was also reportedly one of the first times that such terminology was used by the US. The former Wehrmacht spy chief who oversaw Nazi intelligence on the brutal Eastern Front tapped the men he believed were best suited to recruit and train this new contingent of renegade commandos. The men he chose were a real rogues gallery of former Nazi ideologues and death squad leaders that had intimate knowledge of the people and cultures behind the Iron Curtain. Galen's chosen lackeys would recruit most of their secret commandos from the scores of Eastern European collaborationists that now found themselves as refugees in West Germany. To lead this recruitment effort, Galen called upon 3 former colleagues he had once collaborated with while directing Eastern Front intelligence during World War II. Cookridge calls them the Triumvirate, 3 men that all lived double lives. All 3 of them were university professors, prominent academics in the Third Reich, and yet all 3 also shared interests in irregular warfare and spycraft. The most prominent of Galen's assembled cadre was Dr. Franz Alfred Six, a Königsberg University professor and former SS Brigadeführer, equivalent to a brigadier general during the war. Six had originally been selected by Hitler to head intelligence functions in a Nazi-occupied Great Britain, to eventually work as the top bureaucrat in charge of tracking down high-value targets on a so-called blacklist, which reportedly included Winston Churchill himself, in occupied England. As the Reich shifted its sights eastwards towards the Soviet Union, Six was put in charge of Wachkommand Moscow, a division of Einsatzgruppe B, one of the Nazi commando death squads on the Eastern Front, charged with liquidating communists, Jews, and dissidents throughout Operation Barbarossa, the Nazis' blitzkrieg towards Moscow. His specific division would have been in charge of the eventual purging of occupied Moscow when the Nazi forces were to eventually arrive there. As we all know, that was thankfully never to be. Dr. Franz Six may on the surface appear to be an unusual candidate for a commando death squad leader. An ideologue first and foremost, from his post in Königsberg and later at the University of Berlin, like many other Third Reich professors, Six helped bring a veneer of academic rigor to Hitler's Mein Kampf concept of Lebensraum, or living space, which called for the aggressive expansion and eradication eastward, ultimately into Russia, to provide a greater homeland for the Aryan people. From his post as a professor of foreign political science, Six also moonlighted as the head of the ideological research branch at Himmler's Reich Security Main Office. But Six's evolution from Nazi ideologue to Eastern Front Death Squad leader was not unique to him. A 1982 Washington Post article titled "Nazi Cold War Advisors Went Unpunished" covers the story of Professor Six and another SS major named Friedrich Burkhardt, a Latvian academic who had previously worked under Professor Six at the University of Königsberg, and, much like his supervisor, went on to lead his own Einsatzgruppen Commando Corps in the East. Burkhardt also incidentally went on to work for Allied intelligence post-war, first for MI6 and then the CIA later on. The article describes the makeup of the Einsatzgruppen trial at Nuremberg, the trial that put these commando leaders on the stand. The article states, quote, "Only one of the 24 was a policeman. The rest were educated at the best universities in Germany, and were described by one Nuremberg prosecutor as a, quote, collection of Jekyll and Hydes. And, quote, so many of these men had split personalities. On the surface, not one was a killer," end quote. These Third Reich professors were some of the most rabidly ideological elements of the Third Reich, and in turn, they were some of the most vicious operators within the regime. Galen sought these men out post-war as many evaded prosecution either due to special circumstances, such as we'll see with Professor Six, or by laying low in the immediate post-war years, as some of his colleagues on the Gehlen Org staff did as well. They also importantly had direct experience in special warfare operations and, maybe most chillingly, in purging the East of undesirable elements to the Nazi government. For a group of instructors for the future shock troops of Eastern European counter-revolutions, this purging function was likely seen as a valuable asset. Dr. Six, clearly a suspected perpetrator of war crimes, was caught by Allied intelligence in 1948 and placed before the Einsatzgruppen trial at Nuremberg that same year. Six was eventually sentenced to 20 years imprisonment, but ultimately only served 4 years in prison after his sentence was commuted in 1952 by recommendation of the US High Commissioner to Germany, John J. McCloy, on his way out of the job. Interestingly, McCloy was a good personal friend of Allen Dulles and had been one of the architects of the OSS during World War II. So maybe there was a sort of personal favor called in there by Dulles, but I guess we'll never know. With Six walking free in 52, Galen quickly enlisted him as the main recruiter for his quote-unquote special forces, an apparently invaluable asset as he could tap into former commando squads he had assembled on the Eastern Front during Operation Barbarossa, those members now finding themselves scattered throughout Western Europe. According to author John Loftus, the most significant of these contingents was an especially brutal division of Belarusian commandos, many of which actually end up in the United States under assumed names after their service in the Gehlen Org. But in 1952 and 53, Six worked to integrate these elements into the nascent West German quote-unquote special forces program under his boss Galen. Alongside Professor Six at the top of Galen's secret forces hierarchy were two other Nazi academics turned paramilitary advisors. The second member of this dark triumvirate was one Dr. Michael Akhmatelli, a Georgian scholar who had been a personal friend of the Galen family, according to Cookridge. Akhmatelli's father had struck it rich after oil was discovered under his land in the Caucasus in the early 20th century. Interestingly, by a group of British and American mining engineers that included, of all people, future President Herbert Hoover. Anyways, strange fact there. But from there, the Akhmatelli family ingratiated itself with the Russian imperial elite, with the future Dr. Akhmatelli, Galen's friend, getting his start in paramilitary work, fighting with the White Army during the Russian Civil War. Well, after the ultimate white defeat in that war, the professor settled in Germany, where he became a lecturer in Slavonic studies, according to Cookridge, writing books that outlined Germany's obligation in quote-unquote civilizing communist Russia. During the war, he was closely linked to the Nazi Abwehr, which was their military intelligence functions, where he founded several quote-unquote academic programs that were in actuality fronts for intelligence. He was a close colleague of top Nazi race scientist Alfred Rosenberg and acted as a quote-unquote analyst for Galen's intelligence operations in the East. The Georgian professor's proficiency in several Eastern European languages and his previous experience with the denizens behind the Iron Curtain, especially Nazi collaborationist elements, made him an ideal fit for Galen's secret commando org, especially on the ideological side of the equation. Finally, the third of Galen's cronies was a man named Dr. Emil Augsburg, another academic, this time from Poland. Augsburg, another so-called Soviet expert who was fluent in Polish and Russian, was a member of the SD, the SS's intelligence branch during the war, and served as an SS security police official in Nazi-occupied Poland, where he worked to round up undesirable elements such as Jews, communists, trade unionists, and any other opposing elements to the incoming administration. According to Cookridge, Augsburg initially fled Germany at the end of the war thanks to the underground Nazi program known as Odessa, a secret organization at the end of the war that helped top Nazi officials ferret their way out of Europe to escape the upcoming trials at Nuremberg. Augsburg, a relatively obscure figure in the Third Reich, did not need to escape Europe entirely, instead finding refuge in Italy under Vatican cover, like so many others did at that same level. After a couple of years, he returned to Germany under an alias and was never brought before any tribunals. He had successfully evaded any recourse for his wartime activities. As the third administrator of Galen's commando program, Augsburg brought experience with Polish rebels and dissidents to the org, rounding out the coverage of Eastern European states. Dr. Six covered the Belarusian, Russian, and Ukrainian elements, Dr. Akhmeteli covered the Caucasus, and Dr. Augsburg covered Poland. Augsburg in particular had actually already worked with Western intelligence before he was tapped by Galen in the early 50s, which is interestingly where Ted Shackley first comes into this picture. According to official US government investigations into collaboration with Nazi elements, Augsburg had worked with the Army CIC in 1947 and 48, quote, as an expert on Soviet affairs. Augsburg, a Polish collaborator, and Shackley, a Polish-speaking CIC officer, may have very well crossed paths during the last months of his time at CIC in late 46 and early 47. But more importantly, the reason I spend so much time focusing on the Frank Wisner-initiated Gehlen Org commando program is as a potential explanation for Shackley and his new boss, the former OSS irregular warfare expert Lou Conein's, work at the CIA's Nuremberg base from 1952 to 55. A period that I'll remind you remains somewhat puzzling, especially for Lou Conein, who was an expert in irregular warfare but seemed to be working in more of an intelligence capacity. This might help explain it. Let me get into it. In the book The Blond Ghost, David Korn gives a very surface-level view of Shackley's work at the Nuremberg base from 1952 to 55. Nuremberg, by the way, is only about a 2-hour drive from Munich, where Galen and his commandos were established. Korn nonetheless portrays the Nuremberg assignment as a sleepy posting compared to the more prominent CIA stations throughout West Germany. He notes that Shackley worked on recruiting potential intelligence assets to infiltrate behind the Iron Curtain, pulling these assets from nearby displaced persons camps, such as the nearby Camp Valk. Korn explains the division of labor, as Shackley recruiting and interrogating the recruits, and Lou Conein, the station chief and covert action ace, working with his team to bring the assets to the border and preparing them for crossing. The author had the opportunity to interview Conein for his book, with the latter remembering Shackley well, but downplaying his working relationship with the Blond Ghost. In the interview, Conein stated that he often found Shackley at his desk late into the early morning hours. Again, according to Korn, quote, Shackley was calm and cool, a detailist, who plotted the most minute specifics of an operation, end quote. Now, although the Blond Ghost book portrays Shackley and Conein's work in Nuremberg as largely futile, as they supposedly escorted Eastern European agents to their certain doom by foot across the Eastern Bloc border with Czechoslovakia, with our understanding of the Galen CIA paratrooper program being undertaken simultaneously, Shackley's recruitment efforts, and Lou Conein's former paratrooper irregular warfare experience gains a new light. Could they have been involved in this secret paramilitary project going on simultaneously? Well, with Galen's so-called Special Forces leadership assembled, recruitment began almost immediately in late 1951 and early 52, with Dr. Six joining later in mid-1952 after his release from prison. I will remind you, Conein was dispatched to Nuremberg sometime in the early 50s, apparently before Shackley arrived in 1952. This would coincide exactly with the Galen efforts to infiltrate commandos behind the Iron Curtain. The plan was to recruit former collaborationist elements to infiltrate into the Eastern Bloc, usually by parachute. Galen's commando teams became, in essence, paratroopers, flying from airfields across NATO into the Eastern Soviet-backed republics. For example, the Org's lackeys recruited former Luftwaffe Special Operations ace Edmund Gartenfeld as a parachute trainer, helping to prepare these Eastern European dissidents for their parachute fall into enemy territory. The crack teams were to be the shock troops and organizers for future counter-revolutions behind the Iron Curtain, which is why the paramilitary training was combined with effective political training. The plan was for these former collaborationist elements to parachute in and to make contact with the still remaining anti-communist underground within these countries. Cookridge and Loftus, in their books on the subject, note that the parachuters took off from US airstrips in Wiesbaden, Germany, and an airstrip in the newly minted NATO country of Greece. From there, these elements were to help secretly foment popular revolts against Soviet control within their own territory, primarily by air, dropping them in and having them infiltrate Eastern Bloc civil society with false identities and papers. But before all this, though, researcher John Loftus claims in his book The Belarus Secret that the recruits were first trained in the Bavarian Alps south of Galen's headquarters at Pulak, at the aforementioned future NATO school at Oberammergau, where Shackley got his CIC training, potentially under a young Henry Kissinger. And later, training would then take place at old Wehrmacht and SS facilities at Bad Tölz, also in the Bavarian Alps south of Munich. Okay folks, hang with me here, this is where the story gets pretty insane. So Cookridge claims in his book Galen Spy of the Century that as early as 1951, the most promising of the recruited commandos were being sent for additional paratrooper training at Fort Bragg military base in North Carolina. It's important to note here that the history of US so-called Army Special Forces is fairly recent, with the first Green Berets, as they would come to be known, being established at the earliest in the summer of 1952 as the 10th Special Forces Group Airborne, established at Fort Bragg under former OSS Colonel Aaron Bank. I pull here from Charles Simpson's book Inside the Green Berets, as he explains the creation of the 10th Group at Fort Bragg. He outlines the following, quote, "Its highly secret mission was to exploit the resistance potential behind the Iron Curtain, in the event of the expected Russian invasion of Western Europe. Should war break out, it was visualized that clandestine contact would be established with resistance groups. Upon this agreement, small teams of special forces would be infiltrated, usually by parachute, though conceivably by water or even by ground infiltration, to join them, help them organize and train, call for equipment by radio, and try to influence their activities so as to enhance the overall war effort." End quote. Doesn't this sound oddly similar to Galen's Commando Org being funded simultaneously by Frank Wisner's Directorate of Plans? In sum, the U.S. Army Special Forces, otherwise known as the Green Berets, were first established as a parallel force to Galen's secret commandos, as a sort of offensive Gladio operation. The wild piece here being the U.S. Army Special Forces trace their origins back to Galen's commandos, not the other way around. I will refer you all now to another piece of this puzzle, the Lodge-Philbin Act of June 1950, which allowed for the U.S. Armed Forces for the first time to recruit foreign nationals into the military, specifically to allow for the recruitment of military elements from the Eastern Bloc to assist in operations against the Soviet Union and its satellites. This act essentially allowed the U.S. Army to recruit foreign combatants as soldiers. Such soldiers would, accordingly, come to include some of those Eastern European collaborationist Galen commandos, which started training in Fort Bragg in 1951, just as the first Army Special Forces were being established under the 10th Group. Simpson states the following when discussing the early SF recruits at Fort Bragg. Quote, "All were foreign-born. Most had entered the U.S. Army under the so-called Lodge Bill. legislation which provided a route to American citizenship through military service. In the early days of the forces, a heavy concentration of such men gave the outfit a foreign legion flavor. The team rooms were heavy with foreign accents, and the rosters looked like those of Notre Dame football teams. Those men found full acceptance in the forces." End quote. It wouldn't be too long until these foreign-born recruits would find themselves back on the European landmass. According to Simpson, after, quote, 13 months of training in the United States, the 10th would relocate to their new home in June 1953 to the Army installation at Bad Tolz in southern Bavaria, where Galen's commandos had been training previously. And from there, the divide between Galen's Eastern European Commando Special Forces and the newly minted US Army Special Forces blurred increasingly, until all that was left were the now ubiquitous Green Berets. Now, on an anticlimactic note, Cookridge explained that these paratroopers were largely ineffective at actually spurring popular uprisings behind the Iron Curtain, with most getting caught either while parachuting in or while attempting to infiltrate the anti-communist underground in the countries targeted. Yet I would argue that the legacy of the Galen-Wisner Commando program is far more significant than the actual program itself. From the program came the soon-to-be famous US Army Special Forces, the Green Berets. Forces that Ted Shackley, Lou Conein, and the CIA as a whole would come to rely on in their future operations. Conein, as previously mentioned, was one of the foremost experts on paramilitary warfare and paratrooper tactics from his work during World War II, leading OSS Jedburgh teams in France, and his later work during the war under Paul Helliwell's OSS Detachment 202 in China and Burma, where he once again parachuted behind Japanese lines to connect with and support Allied resistance organizations. This experience during the Second World War would have likely made him an ideal asset as a recruiter and trainer for the secret commando forces and subsequently the early US Special Forces under Group 10 in Germany. Conein would incidentally, a few years later in 1956, after his first tour in Vietnam with Edward Lansdale, be called to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where he helped establish the first low-altitude paratrooper training program at the U.S. Psy-War Center, later to be known as the U.S. Army JFK Special Warfare Center and School. Given Fort Bragg's history as the origin point of the first official U.S. Army Special Forces, Conein's appearance there in '56 as an instructor, his OSS unconventional warfare experience, and work for CIA in Germany in proximity to that very same first class of Special Forces recruit, I personally can't help but wonder if he had some direct role in the Galen program. To me, the connection makes so much sense, and it would help explain his otherwise puzzling appointment in Germany in what has been reported by Korn as a conventional intelligence posting. Now for Shackley. I've already speculated about his potential work recruiting Polish assets for the Wisner-Galen project. But if we look at his future career, specifically his work in Laos and Vietnam in the 60s and early 70s, Shackley would come to interact significantly with Green Berets in the secret war along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In Laos, for example, some of the only official U.S. military forces that were operating in the small Keystone State were these Special Forces contingents. Echoes of the original European anti-communist collaborationist contingent of the Special Forces still remained all the way over in Southeast Asia a decade and a half later. I will point your attention over to one such Green Beret, a Finn named Lauri Torni. Torni, later known as Larry Thorne, had formerly been a member of the Finnish Volunteer Battalion of the Waffen-SS, a collaborationist SS militia of foreigners. After the war, Torni was smuggled into the US through a series of Finnish-Swedish rat lines, and by 1950 had arrived in the US through a convoluted passage through South America. In New York, he was arrested by the FBI a few years later after he was discovered as an illegal alien. Luckily for Torni, through a former acquaintance, Finnish diplomat to the US one Paavo Fleming, he was allowed to immigrate legally. Interestingly, the August 12, 1953 private law, which allowed Torney to stay in the US, as you can see on screen, was acquired by Mr. Fleming's lawyers, employed at the law firm Donovan and Associates, the law firm of none other than Wild Bill Donovan, the head of the wartime OSS. Interesting intersection there, to say the least. But importantly to our story, like many new European migrants into the US, Torney took advantage of the new Lodge-Philbin Act and joined the military in 1954, once his status in the US was legal. Due to his previous experience as a saboteur in the Waffen-SS, he was scouted as a potential Special Forces recruit. Torney was eventually inducted as a Green Beret, and in 1957 he became a US citizen. From 1958 to 62, Torney served in Bad Tolz with the 10th Special Forces Group, the evolution of Galen's original Special Forces commandos. But the point of all this comes with his death. Torney died when his helicopter was downed on October 18, 1965, under still unclear circumstances, while operating with Green Berets on Operation Shining Brass, one of the first U.S. Special Forces missions targeting the Ho Chi Minh Trail. His remains were not found until 1999, and he was subsequently buried at Arlington National Cemetery in 2003, believed to be the only member of the SS to be buried there. But of course, as I've shown today, that could still be up for question. Torney's death on the border of South Vietnam and Laos happened a little under a year before Shackley was brought in to lead the secret war there for the CIA. During his time in Laos, the U.S. Special Forces operations in the ostensibly neutral country were led famously by the McV-SOG Commandos, a highly secretive group of Green Berets, Navy SEALs, Marines, and CIA operators that ran the so-called wet work operations along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Referring to Korn's The Blond Ghost, he notes that Shackley, while station chief in Laos from 66 to 68, would have weekly meetings with General William Westermoreland, commander of the forces in Southeast Asia. Present at those meetings, according to Korn, was then Colonel John Singlob, the commander of McV-SOG commandos in Laos, a large contingent of which were, as previously mentioned, Green Berets. Singlob, for his part, had once served alongside Shackley's former boss in Nuremberg, Lou Conein, when both had served under Paul Helliwell's OSS Detachment 202 in Southeast Asia at the end of World War II. For Shackley's part, he and Singlob would crop up again later in the 1980s as key players in Iran-Contra, both on the funding side. We can see here that Shackley's future closeness to the Green Berets and their hierarchy could indeed hint at his work in Nuremberg recruiting on their behalf from 1952 to 55. For me anyways, this potential work supporting the early US Special Forces could help explain why Shackley was promoted so readily to top CIA posts overseeing the rollout of their unconventional warfare capabilities. Shackley otherwise was mostly known as a traditional intelligence expert, working with assets to gather human intelligence, not so much working to create secret armies like he'd undertake for the agency in Florida, Laos, and South Vietnam. Yet, at the end of the day, this is all speculation on my part. Maybe Shackley and Lou Conein were simply working at a sleepy spy base in Nuremberg, trying to infiltrate assets by foot, and largely failing. We will likely never really know. Nonetheless, I hope you all appreciated this slight detour and speculation on my part. Personally speaking, I find this early Green Berets origin story with the Galen Org super fascinating, especially with the sort of Gladio element. It's something I didn't know before researching this a bit more, and it's something that I'm happy to share with you all. Anyways, returning to our main story today. Sometime in 1955, Shackley was called to the main CIA base in Germany, in the city of Frankfurt. The agency had made itself a home in the old headquarters of the Nazi chemical cartel IG Farben, the massive, imposing campus of one of the main drivers of the Third Reich's military industry. There, in one of the hundreds of offices, the Blond Ghost was told that he would be relocating to the dream location for any young spook, to the spy capital, Berlin. There, the 27-year-old Shackley would meet his first true mentor, that being the boisterous William King Harvey. It would be hard to find more opposite agents than Ted Shackley and Bill Harvey. Shackley, a quiet, meticulous middle manager type, probably struck the gunslinger, heavy-drinking ex-FBI agent Harvey as a soft recruit when he first met him. Yet the two would form an unlikely pair. Shackley quickly emerged as the top agent under Harvey's control at the most important intelligence hotspot in Europe. According to Korn, the West Berlin CIA base employed some 40 to 50 case officers and 150 other employees, a large stable of spies for the still relatively new agency. It was in this environment that the young Shackley honed another of his multitude of skills, that being the art of briefing. Now, important to note here that Ted Shackley was different than most of the CIA heavyweights that are often highlighted, as he specialized in the comparatively mundane tasks that make intelligence run. Paperwork, organizational charts, and brief-ups were Shackley's game, and this did not go unnoticed by the higher-ups at the agency and later by politicians who required up-to-date briefings on ongoing intelligence matters. Shackley was a master at understanding his audience and presenting information in a way that would guarantee the best outcome for the CIA, often by embellishing his briefings based on who was listening. In a sense, he was both an expert at spin and damage control. Be it in West Berlin, where according to Korn he was known as a quote-unquote fabricator by his colleagues, or later in Laos, when he gave a briefing to Senator Stuart Symington of the Armed Services Committee, which guaranteed continued funding for the secret war, according to all sources. Shackley was able to consistently mask the CIA's true intentions while always presenting the rosiest picture possible of its so-called accomplishments. This early success in briefing and quote-unquote fabricating would translate into Shackley's prominence later in Iran-Contra, helping to create and foster the secret financial channels employed by the CIA to illegally fund and arm the rebels in Central America. In other words, Shackley was a master at deflection and plausible deniability, two currencies that became increasingly valuable to the CIA as its operations expanded in scope and illegality. The crowning achievement of Shackley's time in Berlin, and for that matter most of the people in Berlin that worked on this project, at least according to official sources, was his work with Bill Harvey on the now famous Berlin Tunnel. The Berlin Tunnel is one of the most celebrated CIA victories of the early Cold War. Harvey led a team to dig a 1,400-foot long tunnel that ran from the edge of West Berlin all the way to underneath the Soviet-controlled East, where spies tapped into the underground Soviet communication lines to intercept East German communications. The Berlin Tunnel acted as the most successful listening post into East Berlin until its discovery by Soviet authorities on April 24, 1956. The highly publicized and high-stakes intelligence gambit immediately put the Berlin station, Bill Harvey, and by proxy Ted Shackley on the map of CIA upper management stateside. Although Shackley's role in the tunnel project was relatively minor, acting only as a coordinator with British intelligence on the project, according to Korn, his inclusion on Harvey's select group surely guaranteed his continued rise throughout the intelligence hierarchy. The Berlin Tunnel Project prompted Edward Lansdale to label Bill Harvey as the American James Bond. But as far as the actual intelligence value of the tunnel, that remains in question. As a propaganda victory, however, the tunnel allowed the Western press to sing the CIA's praises as they undertook operations that resembled the movies in real life. Other than his work on the tunnel, very little is known about Shackley's time in Berlin, which at this point is starting to become a theme. Like much of Shackley's career, we are left with mere snippets of interviews from colleagues at the time and other people around him. Shackley's time in Germany allowed him to develop unique skills, specifically in intelligence gathering and asset management, that would make him a uniquely valuable agent within the new Directorate of Plans. What needs to be understood, though, is that the CIA was increasingly shifting resources away from typical intelligence functions, the functions that President Truman likely envisioned for the agency upon its creation, and towards more controversial covert action capabilities. This was under the leadership of Director Allen Dulles during the Eisenhower years, when the CIA had a never-ending green light to do pretty much whatever it wanted. The result of this covert action explosion was the CIA increasingly came to be dominated by operator types, leaving much of the traditional intelligence work by the wayside. The issue, however, is that these covert operations, especially as they ballooned in complexity and scope, were also increasingly dependent on accurate intelligence data. Shackley therefore became one of the few agents that had honed his skills in intelligence first and foremost, and later would also develop the capabilities of an efficient covert action and paramilitary planner as well. Having expertise in both of these arenas, in a sense, made the Blond Ghost the ultimate insider spook, able to balance the intelligence gathering functions of the agency to complement the dirty tricks functions that had become so omnipresent under Dulles' leadership. This was no thanks to his extensive time in Germany. Shackley would remain in Berlin until the fall of 1958, having evolved into a worthy spy and bureaucrat. From there, the postings would only increase in importance and scale, as he was on a fast track to the very top of the CIA covert action hierarchy. And after a couple of short postings in Japan and Langley in 1959 and 60, Shackley would be posted to his next high-profile assignment, leading the JMWave station back on US soil in South Florida. There, returning to his home state in early 1962, his legend would begin to unravel as the CIA's secret war against Castro rose to new stakes, as the Kennedy brothers launched their Operation Mongoose. For those first 2 years in Miami before Kennedy's untimely death, Ted Shackley would act as a king of his own fiefdom in the ensuing war on the Gulf Coast. The same war that would bring on the death of the president. Thank you all for watching as always, and I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please leave a like and a comment and let me know your thoughts down below. First and foremost, I would like to thank all of my supporters on Patreon for making these videos possible. On screen now are my producer tier patrons. The video you just watched was first made available to them and all my other Patreon supporters on February 15th, 2025. If you wish to get early access to my content and to sponsor my work, please consider checking out my page on Patreon, linked below in the description. Next week, I hope to complete the second part of my series looking at the making of modern Japan, which has become a real passion project for me. This next video, which will be uploaded shortly, should total over 2 hours in length, which would make it my longest documentary to date. In this video, I will be covering the entirety of the Meiji period, Japan's rapid modernization, and their first imperialistic conquests. All that and much more over on Patreon. Again, linked below. Thank you for your support. The episode today on Ted Shackley will segue very nicely into the video next time, covering the CIA's station in Florida known as JMWave. Shackley would head JMWave from 1962 to 64, which will be the primary focus of that video. Of all the videos I posted on Patreon this year, this was one of the most well received, so I am really looking forward to sharing that with you all on the first Friday of November 2025. But for now though, that's all I've got for today. So thank you all for watching, and remember to always keep your eyes wide open. Take care.